There is a version of Hollywood that exists only in the imagination, a world of dazzling lights, velvet ropes, and screen gods who could do no wrong. For decades, the studio system worked tirelessly to maintain that illusion, controlling narratives, silencing witnesses, and protecting its most profitable assets from the consequences of their own cruelty. But history, as it always does, eventually demanded its reckoning. And few voices have carried more weight in that reckoning than Ron Howard, the boy who grew up on those very studio lots, who watched those legends from the wings, and who, as a filmmaker and a man of conscience, could no longer remain silent about what the golden age of Hollywood truly cost. Howard has always been something of an anomaly in the industry. Where Hollywood is notorious for excess and ego, he built his career on patience, craft, and a deep respect for the people around him. Perhaps that is precisely why the darkness of those who came before him disturbed him so profoundly. He understood, better than most, the difference between the image the cameras captured and the truth that lived behind closed doors. And the truth, in the case of these 6 men and women, was far uglier than any villain they ever played on screen. To understand how Hollywood could protect monsters, one needs to look no further than the story of Errol Flynn. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn arrived in Hollywood and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood in 1935. He transformed from an unknown stock player into a Hollywood idol practically overnight, his combination of physical beauty, devilish charm, and swashbuckling screen presence making him one of the biggest stars of his era. Audiences adored him. Studios adored him more. But beneath the polish was a man who believed his stardom placed him beyond the reach of ordinary morality. In 1942, Flynn appeared in a Los Angeles courtroom to face arraignment on 3 statutory rape charges brought by 2 teenage accusers. The trial, which ran from January through February of 1943, focused national attention on Hollywood's sexual mores and the question of whether fame could truly render a man untouchable. The courtroom became a spectacle. Fans camped outside. Flynn's fans turned out in swarms, filling the courtroom and lining up in the hallway hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Flynn's elite defense team succeeded in discrediting the accusers' testimonies, and the jury returned a not guilty verdict. The acquittal sent a message that would reverberate through Hollywood for generations, that charm, combined with the right lawyers and enough studio muscle, could outrun justice. Flynn's behavior did not improve after the verdict. By 1959, at just 50 years old, his body gave out entirely, ravaged by addiction and years of reckless living. For Ron Howard, who later reflected on the trial as a formative lesson about the industry he had entered, Flynn's story was not a tragedy of a flawed genius, it was a blueprint for Hollywood's moral rot, a demonstration that fame could act as armor against accountability. Kirk Douglas built his legend on portrayals of indomitable men, warriors, rebels, and Spartans who stood defiant against oppression. The cruel irony is that off-camera, Douglas himself was the source of fear for many of those around him. Born Isser Danilovich in 1916 to poor immigrant parents, he clawed his way to the top of Hollywood through sheer force of will. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon, he had seemingly conquered everything. But power, left unchecked, has a way of turning corrosive. Crew members and colleagues described a man with a volcanic temper that erupted without warning, leaving productions paralyzed and people shaken. Stanley Kubrick, who directed Douglas twice, reportedly called him the most driven man he had ever worked with, and the most difficult to control. The dark undercurrent of his career ran deeper than temperament, however. In her memoir Little Sister, Natalie Wood's younger sister Lana would allege that Kirk Douglas sexually assaulted Natalie in the summer of 1955, when she was a teenager. According to Lana Wood, Natalie had asked her to keep the secret in order to protect her career, and it was only after Douglas's death in 2020 that Lana felt free to name him publicly. Lana Wood had previously revealed on a podcast in 2018 that her sister had been raped at a young age by a powerful Hollywood figure, though she had not named Douglas at the time. When Douglas died at the age of 103, the rumors were so closely associated with him that when his name began trending online, Natalie Wood's name trended alongside it. Douglas never faced charges, and the full weight of the allegation was buried under the same institutional machinery of silence that shielded so many powerful men of his era. For Ron Howard, the lesson of Kirk Douglas was not about talent or ambition, but about a system that placed certain men above judgment and called that system prestige. There is a particular kind of damage that does not come from violence but from the slow, deliberate grinding down of another person's dignity. Faye Dunaway was Hollywood royalty by the early 1970s. From Bonnie and Clyde to Chinatown, she brought to her roles a magnetic, icy intelligence that few of her contemporaries could match. But those who worked beside her, not in front of the cameras but behind them, the crew members, the makeup artists, the assistants, told a different story entirely. Dunaway's treatment of production staff became notorious across the industry. Stories accumulated of sudden rages, of objects thrown, of assistants reduced to tears, of demands so extreme they halted filming for hours. During the production of Mommy Dearest, a film in which she portrayed the famously cruel Joan Crawford, cast members reportedly described an atmosphere charged with anxiety, waiting for the next explosion. Director Frank Perry reportedly came close to quitting over her conduct. The performance and the performer had become difficult to tell apart. Her former manager Jay Bernstein was once quoted as saying that Faye didn't just play divas, she became them. By the 2000s, the industry had quietly stopped calling. In 2011, she was fired from a Broadway revival, and rather than reflection, her response was to assign blame everywhere but to herself. For Ron Howard, who cited her as an example of what happens when an actor's need for control metastasizes into something genuinely destructive, Dunaway's arc told a particular kind of cautionary story. Talent and cruelty had coexisted in her for decades, and in the end, the cruelty outlasted the career. John Wayne did not merely play American heroes. For a significant portion of the 20th century, he was the American hero, the cowboy, the soldier, the immovable force of righteous masculinity. Children grew up watching him on black and white television screens and believed, in the uncomplicated way children believe, that the man and the myth were the same. Ron Howard was one of those children. And as Howard later reflected, the distance between the myth and the man was one of the most disorienting revelations of his adult life. On film sets, Wayne's conduct was often described as tyrannical. Technicians who failed to meet his standards were humiliated publicly. Fellow actors operated under a permanent atmosphere of intimidation. Christopher Mitchum once recalled that when Wayne was angry, the air on set seemed to freeze. Howard later said this kind of atmosphere was the opposite of what genuine artistry requires, it was fear dressed up as discipline. But the cruelty was not confined to the workplace. In a 1971 interview with Playboy magazine, Wayne described Native Americans as selfish and expressed his belief in white supremacy, saying that he believed in it until, in his words, black Americans were educated to a point of responsibility. He also stated that he did not feel the country had done wrong in taking land from Native Americans, and dismissed black Americans' pursuit of equality as premature. When these quotes resurfaced and went viral decades later, they prompted calls to remove Wayne's name from an airport in California and sparked a national conversation about how America had chosen to memorialize a man whose private views were so deeply at odds with the ideals his image was supposed to represent. Wayne died in 1979 at the age of 72, still broadly celebrated as an American icon. For filmmakers like Ron Howard, who studied the craft seriously and understood what it required of its practitioners, the Wayne legacy was a test case in how mythology can survive the destruction of the man it was built around. Power built on prejudice, Howard once reflected, does not age into wisdom. It curdles. Roman Polanski represents the question that Hollywood has spent decades refusing to answer honestly: what do we do when the most gifted artists among us are also guilty of the most indefensible acts? For Ron Howard, who openly admired Polanski's early films before the full weight of the truth became undeniable, the question was not merely philosophical. It was personal and moral. Polanski's films, Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, The Tenant, demonstrated a filmmaker of extraordinary visual intelligence and psychological depth. But the darkness he channeled so effectively on screen was not, it turned out, merely a creative resource. In March 1977, Polanski was arrested after drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl during a photo shoot at a Los Angeles home. Rather than face trial, Polanski entered a guilty plea on the lesser charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, but fled the country the night before his sentencing hearing in 1978 when he learned the judge was likely to impose a harsher sentence than anticipated. He settled in France, where he held citizenship and where he has remained ever since, continuing his career as a fugitive from American justice. In 2003, he won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Pianist, accepting it in absentia, unable to attend without risking arrest. The audience at the Dolby Theatre rose in applause. Ron Howard did not rise with them. In later years, he described that moment as one of the most surreal and troubling of his professional life, an industry giving its highest honor to a man who had pleaded guilty to the rape of a child and then run from the law. The Academy eventually expelled Polanski from its membership in 2018. For Howard, Polanski's story is not really about one man's crimes. It is about a system that decided, collectively and repeatedly, that artistic genius was a sufficient reason to look away. A monster does not become less of a monster because he can compose a beautiful shot. That principle should not have needed 40 years to establish itself. The fact that it did says everything about what Hollywood truly valued during its golden age. If Errol Flynn was the golden age's most brazen predator and Kirk Douglas its most feared bully, then Mickey Rooney was perhaps its most tragic figure, a man whose enormous capacity for performance concealed an equally enormous capacity for cruelty toward those closest to him. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first true child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America, and MGM had built an entire fantasy of cheerful, all-American adolescence around his grin. But fame at that scale, absorbed that young, leaves lasting damage. Rooney married 8 times, each marriage a further chapter in a pattern of infidelity, financial recklessness, and emotional devastation. His ex-wife Ava Gardner, who knew him as well as anyone, once described him with withering precision as the shortest man with the largest ego she had ever encountered. Former co-stars described him as capable of extraordinary warmth and equally extraordinary cruelty, sometimes within the span of a single conversation. Judy Garland, his closest collaborator during the MGM years, hinted privately that Rooney bore some responsibility for the emotional suffering that plagued her throughout her life, suffering that had many architects within that system.